Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Real pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Melvin Rogers, Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Brown University, author of The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Very rudimentary question. I just want to start here. I'm a big fan of intellectual history. What's the value of it as a discipline? I mean, like where the sort of tracking the genesis of thought and intellectual strains within the context of a movement or of history writ large. Like, what's the value of it to us in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there is a great deal of use in trying to get clear about the ideas that are responsible for structure in the world that we inhabit now. And the best way to do that is to go back in time and try to chart those ideas. Whether it's the ideas that we recoil from and we're trying to avoid, or whether it's the ideas that constantly seem to be a source of hope, that constantly seem to revitalize the present.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were just talking about J.D. Vance's sort of like a tour where he is sort of justifying, I guess at this point, like the spreading of these lies about Haitian immigrants, being legal or illegal, but even more relevant, or I should say undocumented, or even more relevant as to, what they're doing to the community. And it's helpful to know that this is, sort of like the rumor is generated by literal self-identified Nazis, because at one point the idea sort of mutates, or at least becomes like a different, I guess I talk about it like goes from a solid to a gas by the time it gets like expressed by maybe a J.D. Vance. But what the essence of it is. And that's what sort of, I guess, brings some light to it. So with that said, you are like, you track Black intellectual, I guess, thought through the early 19th century, maybe around the 1830s through into the 1960s. And the idea being that there is been widely considered two sort of, I guess, dispositions towards America and the American project, as it were, that place Black folk, or their perspective, having come as in this country, or come from slavery in many instances, most, particularly early on. Will you outline those two sort of like distinct sort of, I guess, flavors of thought, and then sort of place where your book is in terms of what the argument as to this other strand of thought?
Right. So the point of the book is to try to understand more clearly why it is African-American intellectuals and activists from, as you say, from the 1830s through the 1960s, to try to understand why they remain so committed to the United States amid ongoing practices of oppression, domination, exclusion, and the like. And when we go back in time to the 1830s, we see one of the lines of inquiry that I track, to just sort of put it in, I think, in simple terms, is a commitment to the American polity. A sense that the United States can be better than what it is, and a sense that the United States can be better than what it is in its treatment of Black people, precisely because the nation, white Americans, Black Americans are not finished products. We're plastic. We can develop and grow. On the other side of this, I think, sort of against this view, is the idea, you see it very famously in the abolitionist and Black nationalist Martin Delaney of the 19th century, an extraordinary figure. But you see in him the idea that no, the degradation of Black people, the insistence on white supremacy, these are not just simply aberrations of American life. These are at the core of American identity. And therefore, Black people ought to strongly consider picking up and leaving. And you can see this strain in Martin Delaney, which is the figure I spend most time on. But if you were to come forward in time, you would see it again in the 1920s with that extraordinary Black nationalist Marcus Garvey. And if you came on up to the 1960s, you can find it in the Nation of Islam. And my book, in attempting to lay out those who were committed to the American polity, it tries to defend a set of ideas that I think are still active in American culture today, and that makes sense of why it is you still have the African Americans committed to transforming American society.
And one of those figures who I guess represents that that philosophy is David Walker. Tell us about him and his, I guess his most defining piece, I guess, is a pamphlet essentially he wrote in 1829.
Yes. So David Walker is born in 1796 in Wilmington, North Carolina. He's free because his line of freedom follows the status of his mother, who was free. As he grows up, he slowly makes his way north and settles in Boston in 1825 and quickly becomes a member of the small but growing African-American community there. David Walker is politicized by what he sees on his journey from the South to the North, and he is interested in striking a blow at the heart of slavery. And so he writes this extraordinary pamphlet, 1829. It travels along the eastern seaboard south. It reaches Georgia and Louisiana. And it is an incendiary text because it's partly a sort of call to arms to African Americans to stand up and answer the call of freedom amid practices of enslavement and domination. And it is also an attempt to sort of shake his white counterparts into understanding that the call to action by Black people is simply and significantly the result of a commitment that they themselves once fought for, a commitment to freedom, right? That which they fought for against the British crown in the 1770s. And in David Walker, you see, in some ways, both of those two elements that I identified earlier. On the one hand, you see a David Walker who is committed to the transformation of the United States, but you also see in that text a side of David Walker that says, look, if white Americans won't transform, then Black Americans must reevaluate their relationship to the polity and what those various options would mean. But David Walker, I insist, is a critical figure, and he's a figure that's then subsequently read. He's read by Martin Delaney. Frederick Douglass famously reads him. As you come downstream, W.B. Du Bois reads him. And so in this regard, he is a sort of signature and I think unattended to figure in American and African American political thought.
Speak a little bit about his perspective on Thomas Jefferson, because I took my kids to Monticello last year, and they came back a little more skeptical of Thomas Jefferson, I have to say. Credit to the tour guides there and whatnot, but I think like they were I don't want to say they were jaundiced, but I guess that's the point, right? Like you're riding that knife's edge on some level.
Right. I mean, David Walker, and this is historically both before David Walker and after, African-American intellectuals and activists have always had a very complicated relationship to Jefferson. because despite the fact that the Declaration of Independence is written by a committee, historically and how we sort of think about it in the public imaginary, Jefferson is its author. Jefferson is the one who articulates the sort of foundational values of the United States. This is sort of how we understand it. And Jefferson thus occupies a position, even in the 1830s, in the American imaginary that is unmatched by any other American founder. And Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia of the 1780s, had very incendiary things to say about African Americans and their moral and political capacities. And Walker, by the time he writes the pamphlet in the 1820s, 1829, Walker is very clear that we should not think Jefferson's words will just simply pass quietly into the night. That given Jefferson's status, it is a different level of critique and attack on African Americans. And for just this reason, he says, David Walker says, we must prove his words wrong. And what he means by that is that African Americans must do what they can to lay claim to freedom and perform the very thing that Jefferson is saying that they do not have the capacity to perform, which is to be self-governing agents and to recognize when that self-governance is in danger. The other thing I would say about this sort of Walker going after Jefferson in this pamphlet that is structured according to 4 articles, and in using the language of articles, it should bring to mind the Constitution. And the fact that he goes after Jefferson, and he is very clear that Americans don't seem to understand the implications of their words as written in the Declaration. It suggests, if you keep those two things in mind, the Declaration on the one hand and the Constitution on the other, it suggests that Walker is really trying to displace Jefferson as the founder to which one can look for guidance and install in his place the pamphlet that Walker is offering you. And if you really believe the words of the Declaration, then you will understand that the claim about the equality of persons applies to all human beings, regardless of their hue.
And what was contemporaneously with him writing that pamphlet, like to what extent were we seeing, particularly in the North, Black, if not self-governance, governance? I mean, like, or at least engagement with the political process as a citizenry. I mean, you know, I think we certainly know in the context of Reconstruction, at least for a brief period of time, we saw a lot of like Black politicians in South Carolina and the Carolinas. I mean, ultimately there was this, blowback, or I guess, but within the context of like the 1830s, pre-war period, what existed that gave Walker that sense of like, this is a model for Black governance?
Right. So I think there's a couple of things to sort of keep in mind when we think about the early American Republic. The idea of politics and organizing was, or what we would call organizing, was a very capacious idea. So there was, of course, the formal structures of government, the recognizable institutions that we identify at the federal and state and city level. But then, of course, there's what we might consider the sort of informal practices of politics in civil society. So between the 1830s and the 1850s, for example, you had a developing African-American community that was producing newspapers, that was producing and developing literary and philanthropic organizations that that established a Negro convention organization that could serve as a nexus point for bringing African Americans together to reflect on the great problems of their day, mainly the persistence of slavery and practices of domination. And all of these things essentially performed in an informal way practices of self-governance that they were formally denied in terms of participation in the state and federal government.
And that quality of civic virtue and whatnot, this runs up against, this is when I guess, Delaney would basically, I mean, how much did Delaney sort of eschew this, like, and just sort of say like, okay, just we need to leave, type of thing, and bring us forward in time as sort of Walker's ideas resonate, but still there's this parallel sense of, like you say, that traverses through time too, of this project is immutable in some way.
Right. So the thing I would say about someone like Martin Delaney is that all of the figures, whether we're talking about David Walker, the abolitionist Mariah Stewart, Frederick Douglass, as we come forward into the 1890s, Ida B. Wells, all of them agreed that racial injustice and practices of domination, those were the problems. And all of them agreed that what was generating that was claims about what race meant. But they disagreed on what the response ought to be and whether or not the United States was sufficiently flexible to become something other than what it was in its treatment of African Americans. As you come forward in time, let's say Ida B. Wells, the extraordinary Black journalist, who is now, where after the Civil War, the new manifestation of white supremacy, let's just call it that, is the lynching of Black people, and Ida B. Wells is going directly at that. Ida B. Wells also sides with David Walker in holding out the prospect of transforming white Americans. And the reason why she holds this out is because she does believe that Americans are attached to a certain kind of vision of themselves on the international scene. They do not want to be understood as both the so-called greatest defenders of freedom and the greatest violators of it, right? And so Ida B. Wells will often speak to a domestic audience, but she was also interested in speaking to an international audience in an attempt to sort of shame white Americans and the American government to a position of moral rectitude as it related to racial justice.
How did that, I guess, is a question of how did the intellectuals of this time borrow from, if at all, maybe internationalist perspectives or anti-abolition or abolitionist writers, maybe from Great Britain or other areas of the country, of the world?
Right. So, I mean, all of this is part of the, all of this is part of, let's call it the, Sam, I want to go back to your earlier term. All of this is part of the atmosphere of abolitionism. And whether it's in Britain or whether it is in the United States, all of abolitionists in various forms are sort of insisting on the commitment to freedom and equality. What they're struggling with in various ways are what are the sort of levers we can pull on to help induce in our audience, to help induce in them a desire to transform. And keep in mind, this is a period, and dare I say, unlike our own, this is a period in which ideas of virtue and character still matter. This is a period in which shame still matters. And so in their mind, appealing to the character of their audience and attempting to shame them into the right position, it was reasonable for them to hold out the thought that that could work. Right? Yes, the Civil War, if we go back in time, yes, the Civil War itself, the actual war, is responsible for the transformation of the United States. But the Civil War comes about because of earlier abolitionists engaged in rhetorical and moral appeals to their fellows, preparing the ground for the actual Civil War.
I think, I mean, and we'll talk about this briefly in a moment, but projecting forward, that embarrassment or sense of shame in the international stage, certainly like during the Cold War, that certainly helped, sort of, I guess, like move at least from an institutional level, civil rights forward. But I want to just go back in terms of like Ida B. Wells and the way that she would, she talked about post-Reconstruction. Laws had begun to change, at least, to some extent. I mean, certainly there a large sort of like constitutional framework had been developed in Reconstruction. She still talked about unwritten laws that existed relative to Black people in the context, within the United States. But what did Reconstruction and the subsequent like retrenchment of white power, very often violently, and certainly, ranging from like violent retrenchment to sort of malignant neglect, coming from like the federal government and maybe the North broadly speaking of that retrenchment. What did that do to the perspective of people who thought like, this is a ongoing project, and we're not perfect yet, but we're trying to get there. When you see like one or two steps forward and maybe arguably like 1.5 steps back, what happened ideologically speaking, or in terms of those ideas?
Right. I mean, one of the things about this, Sam and Emma, that is actually quite significant and that we ought not to understate is the ways in which we know that African Americans were pushing for formal legal standing. We know African Americans were demanding that they be treated as equals. And we know that we get the Civil War amendments that sort of establish their standing in political society. But we also know, Sam, as you just laid out, that we subsequently get a retrenchment of white supremacy, which is a sort of elevation of white Americans above non-whites, and it displays itself concretely in the treatment that's on display against African Americans post the Civil War. But these African American intellectuals also never lost track of the fact that what you also want to change as well is the culture that sustains these new laws. And if the laws have been transformed, but the culture itself has not, then ordinary everyday Americans will look for opportunities to violate the law, or look for opportunities to do injustice legally, right? And so part of what these thinkers were always trying to keep in view for us were the two levels on which American democratic life functions: the legal institutional level, and then this cultural level. And so what you see during the period Reconstruction and beyond, the period of Jim Crow, what you see is white supremacy still at work in the sort of cultural atmosphere of American life, which is what Ida B. Wells refers to as the invisible laws. The culture that basically authorizes white Americans in believing, regardless of the law, that African Americans can still be dominated, policed, and dare I say, extinguished.
I guess that relationship between like sort of the culture and the statutory progress, I guess, is sort of, I don't know. I have just the vision of like, I had to lift a bureau over the weekend, and like you sort of wedge it back and forth, and one corner goes forward about 6 inches, and then you got to use that corner to go forward the next 6 inches with that. All right. Well, let's talk about, then let's shoot up to Billie Holiday and who you write about in viewing this era of the 1930s or 20s, when we had this sort of like that was almost like the peak of the retrenchment. Mm-hmm. We should say, I bring this up all the time, but when we had all this controversy about all these Confederate statues that were going down, this is when most of those were built, somewhere between 1910 and 1925. Also at a time where we had, 10,000 KKK plus maybe at Madison Square Garden. We had almost 6 million card-carrying KKK members at a time where we had 100 million people in the country. The number was probably maybe even higher than that. So this is that era of the 20s and early 30s and maybe the teens is sort of the peak of this retrenchment. And just, I guess, tell us about Strange Fruit.
Right. So if you sort of follow the conversation that we've been having up until this point, we now know a couple of things. We now know that African Americans are trying to sort of persuade their white counterparts to be better than they are in their treatment of Black folks. We now know that some of the ways that they tried to do that had to do with the emotional states, let's call them, of white Americans. Can we shame them into a position of moral rectitude? We also know that the reason why they held that out as a possibility is because they thought that their white counterparts, like human beings generally, are flexible, that we're not in some final way settled. Into Billie Holiday and Strange Fruit. Originally called Bitter Fruit, it was a poem written by Abel Maripol, a Jewish American. And this was written, from our understanding, based on his encounter with a lynching photo, that is to say, a photo of an actual lynching. And he was so horrified that he wrote the poem called Bitter Fruit. He would subsequently put that to music, offer it to Billie Holiday, and it would become a Strange Fruit. Holiday was performing this song at various locations, clubs, and the like. And Billie Holiday had a specific way of performing this song and having it staged. At Cafe Society, where she used to perform it in New York, as soon as she would enter on the stage and that song would start, all of the service stopped. A spotlight was set upon her, and she would sing the song without interruption. And as she sung the words of the song, Strange Fruit, she would often contort her mouth to sort of mimic for her audience the horror of lynching. The song is about lynching. And part of what she was trying to do in the way that she could do what her skill set as a musician, as an artist, part of what she was trying to do was to perform in the song and on her body what she wanted to elicit, bring out of her audience. We all should cringe in disgust at what lynching represents. So here now we have a figure that literally is telling us that democracy is not merely about institutions, it's not only about culture, but it literally is wrapped up in our bodily comportment toward our fellows. What we cringe at in relation to what is violated in them. And so Billie Holiday performed this song. Her mother reportedly didn't want her to do it, but she said in the way that she could contribute that she thought that this could make the country better.
Before we get to James Baldwin, who's sitting right there above your shoulder, but before we get to him, with this, how does that sort of dynamic of shame work in the absence now of through the 1800s and early 1900s, so this idea of like, we want to prove that we're not just a, podunk colony, that we have some sophistication. And one of the ways that we do that is sort of like to promote freedom. I mean, I'm not saying everybody felt this, but there was that was the sort of the toehold in terms of shaming people. And certainly during the Cold War, a similar dynamic. We need to prove to the third world that we're not as racist as the Soviet Union is claiming. But we're now like in an era, it seems, where it's denial, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not, there isn't, I mean, we certainly have some people who are sort of like proudly racist, but the sort of main thrust is denial. Like, we've had a black president, racism is over. Or, I'm talking about, it's coincidence that it's Haitian immigrants, legal immigrants I'm talking about. What I'm really talking about is we need more social services for, residents, even though I don't promote that. Like, there is a denial that goes on. What does that do? What does that leave for the tactic, the strategy of shame? What does that do to that?
Yeah, I mean, Sam, this is a very important question, and it's a very challenging one, because why would I engage in a tactic of shame? Let's use a different emotion. Why would I appeal to you for sympathy? It must be because I think contained within your inventory of values that define who you are the kinds of values that I can hook into that would make you show or incline you to show sympathy for my position and thus be willing to help me, or that would incline you to feel that you've fallen below a level or a set of values that you're committed to, thus inducing in you a sense of shame, because that's what shame is about. To feel shame is to feel that you've fallen below a set of values that you otherwise take yourself to be committed. When your parents say to you after you've done something, shame on you, and the moment in which you sort of lower your head in shame, it is because you and your parents identify with a set of values that orient you. So that's what's informing the tactic. And yes, on the other side, you do have denial. You do have the performance of that's not really what I was doing or what I was talking about. And when you engage in this tactic, what you're really hoping for is that there are enough people in the room that share the value and that's bearing witness to the denial, and that you can move. But one, right, these figures are, the figures that I talk about in the book, the thinkers I talk about in this book, they're not interested in the most committed racist. That's not who they're talking to. They're talking to Americans that are on the fence, who seem not to fully understand the full gravity of what is going on, attempting to move them to their side and effectively build up a kind of moral majority on the issue. But that doesn't preclude the fact that there will still be the real racists out there. And it doesn't preclude the fact that they will often come back around and try to figure out ways how to move people to their side. And sometimes they will do it by claiming that what they're really after is the protection of services in the community. And it just so happens that it's these people who happen to be Black that are a danger to those services.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation seems, more submerged and in some ways, ironic relative to I'm reacting to a picture of lynchings, as opposed to like the way our tax our tax system is written up actually is maybe not prima facie, but sort of like de facto racist because it's been created by a white structure. But
And on this point, some would argue for just this reason of what you described, that seems to be telling in the direction of Delaney's argument. Because look, we've moved across time, and although white supremacy in one sense is not as, depending on what time we're talking about, it's not as evident as it was before, it seems to have mutated and figured out ways to mask itself. Even though a great many of us can say, no, I can pull that back and there's this thing there. And Delaney would say, see, the fact that it keeps coming back is indicative of the fact that this might be what America really is.
What did James Baldwin have to say about that?
Well, I mean, James Baldwin was under no illusion that the devaluation of Black people, the elevation of white Americans, he had no illusions that this was part and parcel of American culture. What he denied and rejected was that it exhausts the full meaning of American culture and its politics. And what David Walker says is that, look, we ought not to tell ourselves stories about our inevitable and inescapable progress. These are the things Americans, we like to tell ourselves, that we're always on an upward trajectory. And that in fact, there's no way that we could not be on an upward trajectory. And Baldwin's insistence that it is the belief in that will prompt us over time not to attend to the way in which our past history continues to show itself in the present. Because if you confront it, then you will have to accept the possibility that we are not on an upward trajectory, and it is not fated for us to be on an upward trajectory. And that's a difficult thing for us. And I want to now insert myself here. That's a difficult thing for us as Americans to accept. But Baldwin thinks that the true test of American democracy is our willingness to confront this honestly and to figure out what are the resources and habits we have to cultivate to make us nimble and agile when our history, our past comes back at us.
I mean, I guess that's a tough thing to navigate even from his perspective there, because the other conclusion you can make if you're like, this is, inherent and everlasting is like, what's the point?
So I think the way Baldwin wanted us to think about it is that our past, our collective past, our individual past, particularly when it's traumatic, can't help but leave its trace on us. And sometimes it leaves its trace in a way where we lean into it. We become the darkness that is part of our past. Or sometimes it leaves its trace in the ways in which we're trying to build forward and against that past. But what's interesting about that second move is that there's no way to understand or even to articulate to others why you are building forward and in this particular way without telling the story of your past. That it is there, that it is constitutive of who you are, foundational to who you are, does not mean that it finally controls you. It is in you, but it need not have you. Right? And it was that possibility that Baldwin holds out as a space for Americans to both be mindful of their past without being controlled by it. But if you follow Baldwin, then you're gonna have to reject some other things that are part of, let's call it America's public philosophy, which is we have to accept that even when we in the present are not responsible for that history in the sense of being the cause of it, we're still responsible for what it does to us in the present. And so the question is, are you going to act in response to it, to deal with it, to figure out how to respond to racial injustice, although you're not the actor that brought it into existence? Or are you going to say, I never owned slaves, right? This kind of language in our society. So that means you gotta reject different ways of thinking about responsibility and adopt new ways of thinking about responsibility. Responsibility that you might have for things that you yourself didn't do, but that's still affecting the communities to which you belong and the relationships that you have with your fellow citizens.
Dr. Melvin Rogers, the book is The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm. Really appreciate your time today. Really interesting stuff.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.